Welcome, everybody. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. And I'm thrilled to be with you today for the Hannah Arendt Center Virtual Reading Group. We are starting a new book. It's always exciting to me when this happens. I'm glad we got through The Life of the Mind. It's a long book. For those of you who made it through the whole thing, give yourself a pat on the back. It's not an easy book, and it's not one that's widely read. So I'm glad you all made it through. The next book we're reading, On Revolution. This is an old copy of it, but one thing I'll say is that this is one of the books of Arendt that has been done an enormous disservice by the publishing industry, insofar as there's now 4 or 5 different editions, and they all have different paginations. And so I apologize for that. I use this edition, which is the first edition. But I also have in my book marked all the page numbers for one of the Penguin editions, but there's now 3 different Penguin editions with 3 different paginations. It's just become ridiculous. So I'll do my best to let you know what page I'm on, but I won't always be able to. And if people find the page, they can always put it in the chat. In any case, this is when I'm asked what's the most relevant or important book to read today, and I'm asked that a lot of Arendt's. And I think most people expect me to say Origins of Totalitarianism. And let me say, I love that book, and I do believe that almost everything Hannah Arendt ever wrote after it is already contained in Origins, in situ, if you understand it. And I think it's just it's probably her best book in that sense, most concentrated. But I think her most relevant book is not Origins of Totalitarianism today. It's On Revolution. This is the book. First of all, it's the last monograph she ever finished. A Life of the Mind she never finished. And she finished this book On Revolution in 1963, same year as she finished Eichmann in Jerusalem. But it's in this book that she grapples with, I think, the fundamental problem of our age, the fundamental political problem of our age, which is founding a new polity. How does one found a new polity, a new politics, a new people? Okay, well, why is that the problem of our age, right? I mean, we already have polities. And in this book, she's talking about 2 particular revolutions, the American Revolution and the French Revolution. Well, I think it's the problem of our age because, as you all know, Hannah Arendt was convinced that the rise of the modern age, of science, and the rise of the rise of science, and eventually the Holocaust and totalitarianism, had what she called, and as she put it, shattered the pillars of our tradition, had brought about a break in our tradition, right? And the idea here is that, as she says in her essay On Authority, most people throughout history don't think too deeply most of the time. We just don't have time. We have other concerns. And we are largely kept in check by tradition, right? A tradition that tells us, don't kill, turn the other cheek, treat your neighbor as you'd like to be treated yourself, the golden rule, and certain other fundamental values that are part of our moral, ethical, and political traditions. Don't kill your political enemies, being one, right? Um, and what she says is that this tradition has been broken. And so much of her writing in the 1950s, right, is about the break in tradition, the loss of authority. So she starts her essay, "What is authority?" Um, with the line more or less saying, "Well, I should call it what was authority because authority's been broken, has been lost," and and that's important to her because if you don't have authority, you can't have freedom. Because what authority means is that the powers that control the world, the government, the president, the Congress, whoever, the courts, are seen to control the world with justice. They're seen to be authoritative. They're seen to be legitimate. And she says that without legitimate authority, all control, and you always need control, is illegitimate and unfree. And so the problem of authority um, and the loss of authority is central to her work, which is why she writes these two essays, What is Authority and What is Freedom, together. And if What is Authority begins with this observation that we have lost authority and thus lost the possibility for freedom, it shouldn't be a surprise that What is Authority ends with the question of how do we refound authority? How do we reestablish a political body, a common world that obviously we're going to disagree on, right? Politics is about plurality. We're going to have disagreements. We're going to disagree. I'm going to want to do one thing. You're going to do one another. I'm going to believe in abortion. You're not going to believe in abortion. I'm going to believe in gun control. You're not going to believe in gun control. Things like that. Yeah, that's going to happen. But how do we build a public world that we can share, that we can live in together? And that requires the founding of authority. And she says in the essay on authority, well, this is the question of revolution, right? Um, on Revolution, right, is her book that looks into how we can found a new politics, found a new authority, create a stable and yet free political world on the ruins of a broken world. That's what she's asking. And, she wrote this in 1963, but 70 years later, I'm assuming you all are convinced of the brokenness of our world. I mean, the last week has been even the cherry on the top, and I don't mean that in a good way. The world is polarization is no longer a word that counts, right? We are entering a spiral of descent. We have been in for a long time. I mean, Arendt already thought in the 1960s that we were in what she calls a revolutionary situation. She takes the word from Marx, right? But what she says is, and by a revolutionary situation, she means in the death of authority, that people no longer believe that the people in charge should be in charge or have any authority or have any legitimacy. But what she says is a revolutionary situation can go on for decades or centuries because a revolutionary situation will only lead to a revolution, she says, when the revolutionaries are able to pick up the broken shards of power and authority and reconstitute them anew, when they're able to found a new government, a new world. And that's the problem of revolution. That's the problem of founding. And so if you accept, as Arendt accepts, and certainly I am with her on this, that our world is broken, you have to understand that brokenness can go on for a long, long time, right? But how do you refound a world, right? One answer is you sort of have a revolution, and we'll talk about what she means by that, and that will come up starting next week, really. But a revolution for her is a revolving back to the beginning. somehow you take the principle from which the world that is broken started from, and you breathe new life into it, right? Can that be done? What is the principle? Was it democracy? Was it republicanism and small r republicanism? Was it liberalism? Um, Whatever it was, can those ideas be resuscitated, reborn, or are they over? Are we in a post-liberal, post-democratic, post-republican age, or can they be re-energized? And if they can't be re-energized, right, what comes next? Well, then something cataclysmic, but at least as a precursor to something new. And so I take very seriously that this is her most relevant book today, because I think she wrote it because she believed that our world was broken, the pillars of tradition had ended, and she asked herself continually, how do we rebuild? And revolution is the answer. That doesn't tell us what to do. It doesn't tell us what the revolution should look like. But she thinks that the only way to rebuild is to have a revolution. And what that means is what we're going to be exploring over the next 3 months as we read this book. It's one of the most, I think it's her last book. It's her most mature book. I think this is an extraordinary piece of writing and thinking, and I very much look forward to revisiting it with you. Um, One other way to think about this book is that for those of you who are with us for The Life of the Mind, right, which we just finished reading in this group, um, uh, she ends The Life of the Mind, right, which is never finished, but the second part of The Life of the Mind, which is called Willing, she ends The Life of the Mind um, with a chapter 16 of the book on Willing, called The Abyss of Freedom and the Novus Ordo Secularum. The Novus Ordo Secularum, which is the new order of the ages, which of course is the motto on the American US dollar bill, um, and was the revolutionary slogan, right? She ends the chapter on Willing with this motto, with a turn towards revolution, because she says the chapter on Willing was about freedom. And she says that the entire tradition of Western thought has misunderstood freedom, right? Freedom has been associated with the will. And insofar as it's been associated with the will, it's been associated with evil. And thus, philosophers and thinkers have turned away from freedom and said we have to limit freedom and freedom of the will because it's dangerous. And the entire book that she writes about is this give and take between freedom and the desire to limit freedom because freedom is dangerous. But I mean, one of the most brilliant aspects of Arendt's many brilliant moves in her life and thoughts in her life is that she invents, or at least is the first to fully articulate, a counter tradition of freedom to the freedom of the will, right? And she says that we need to turn away from freedom understood through will and turn to freedom understood through action and the men of action. And in this final chapter of The Life of the Mind, she says that we see a hint of this in Montesquieu, and Baron von Montesquieu's work, The Spirit of the Laws, where Montesquieu at one point says freedom is not about the will, but is about power. He says that political liberty, political freedom consists not in safety, not only in safety, but also in the power to do what you want to do, not in will, but in power. And this freedom as power is the freedom that we have to act collectively, to create, to build a political world, to begin, to found a world. And freedom, thus, for her, in the counter tradition, that doesn't mean the freedom of the will, is the freedom to found, to start something new, to begin spontaneously something new. And this is the question she says we need to ask is, how do we begin something new? And she says in The Life of the Mind, well, if we look back to the great foundation legends, right? In the Bible, the foundation legend starts with Cain killing Abel, right? In Rome, it starts with Romulus killing Remus, the two twins, right? The brothers, Cain and Abel, Romulus brothers, twins, fratricide, right? The beginning of all political, religious traditions, all authorities begin in a kind of fratricide, in violence. And these founding legends, she says, share a common structure. They begin with a violent liberation, they include a hiatus, and they end with the foundation of a new revolutionary politics. And so that's what we're going to be exploring in this book. Now, if you take her seriously, and I think you should, it doesn't mean you have to agree with her, but you should at least listen to her and take her seriously. What she's saying is that if you really do believe with her that that our world is broken, that the tradition has been shattered, and that we need a new founding, three things. One, violence is going to be part of it, right? There's never been a founding without violence, she says. Two, violence doesn't complete the founding. There's always a hiatus after the violence. And three, the foundation of freedom, which comes about after that hiatus in a new revolutionary politics, needs to both to do two things. One, to allow power in the kind of collective action, power and freedom to emerge and participate in the new polity. And two, it needs somehow to create authority. And that's the hardest question. How do you create authority? And chapter, mostly in chapter 5, a little bit in chapter 4, is where Arendt explores the ability or the luck, the fact that the American Revolution, in a way that all the other modern revolutions that she looks at failed, the American Revolution succeeded in founding a new authority, which she said was founded in and based in a faith in almost a religious faith in the Constitution of the United States of America. Um, and that, she thinks, was the secret that allowed the foundation of freedom in the United States to come to be. The last chapter, chapter 6, is how that authority in the Constitution was lost, right? The lost treasure of the revolution, or the revolutionary tradition and its lost treasure. And that's where she traces how the revolutionary founding of freedom that she thinks happened in America was lost. So if you want to think about the book as a whole, chapter 1 is the meaning of a revolution. What is a revolution? I just gave you a little bit into that, but we'll get much more into that next week. Chapter 2 is the social question, which is, in a sense, the great danger of most modern revolutions. If the point of revolution is to found freedom, right? The social question, to the extent that we get concerned not about freedom, but about comfort, or ending poverty, or equality and other things, social equality as opposed to political equality, we, in her mind, turn away from freedom in the name of trying to create a kind of social equality, and that destroys the possibility of founding freedom, or it makes it almost impossible. And so the social question is an important chapter. It's going to be very controversial. It's probably the most controversial chapter in the book, and we're going to spend 2 weeks on it because it's so interesting and so profound and also challenging and controversial. So we'll get into that. Chapter 3 is the pursuit of happiness, which is about the way in which happiness is reinterpreted in the revolutionary tradition as freedom, and how that happens and why happiness and freedom go together. The two core chapters of the book, as far as I read the book, are chapters 4 and 5. They're called Foundation 1 and Foundation 2, right? They are about the foundation of freedom, the revolutionary foundation. Foundation 1 is Constitutio Libertatis, the Constitution of Freedom. How do you found freedom? And Foundation 2 is Novus Ordo Secularum. How do you create a new order, a new authority in the ages? And then chapter 6, the revolutionary tradition and its lost treasure, is about the way in which we've lost the foundation of freedom and how that happened and what it might require to bring it back. What do I want to say about this short introduction called War and Revolution, which we read for today? It's only 11 pages. It starts with this quote from Lenin, right? That, or not quote, but a reference to Lenin, that wars and revolutions have determined the physiognomy of the 20th century. And what she means by this is that we have wars and revolutions, but they've outlived all their ideological justifications. That's the key point here. We used to have wars for socialism or communism or for democracy or for imperialism or capitalism, right? And she says no longer, right? War has become too violent and too destructive to justify any of those kind of wars, right? And so the only thing really left, the only issue that can justify the kind of utter destruction that modern warfare includes is freedom. It's the only cause left, she wants to say. And it's the last justification for war and revolution. And insofar as revolution is the kind of violent act that pursues the foundation of freedom, part of the argument of this book is that all wars turn into revolutionary wars, right? It's almost impossible, she thinks, to fight a non-revolutionary war today. The second point I want to make is that she says that this focus on freedom is the only justification for war and thus revolution is surprising, because in modern politics, we denigrate and downgrade freedom. This goes to the chapter on the social question that I mentioned earlier, right? We see freedom as a lower middle class prejudice, she says on page 2. Those of us who are smarter and more intellectual and more enlightened understand that no one's free. We're all subject to social and biological and other determinant factors, right? And so, if someone does well in life, it's because they had advantages and they were given certain advantages, and it was, they lived in the right zip code, or they had the right genes, or whatever it is. And if someone does badly, the opposite. Freedom disappears in revolutionary vocabulary because we're all subject to what we would call social forces, laws of history, dialectical materialism, whatever you want to call it. The third point I want to make about this chapter is that she distinguishes war from politics, right? Freedom, which for most of history was unconnected to war, has intruded into the debate about war and the justification of violence, right? So for the Greeks, she does a little history of war here, which is it's quite useful. For the Greeks, she says war was apolitical because it was violent, and violence was antithetical to politics. Politics is about persuasion, and war is about violence. And the Greeks didn't even think about how to justify war. They just thought it was outside of politics. The Romans were the first to try and justify war, but for the Romans, war was simply justified by necessity. But necessity could mean almost anything for the Romans. It could mean conquest was necessity, right? Or expansion, or to pursue your interests, or maintain your power. And so, again, there was a justification for it, but quite wide. The idea that a war of aggression is unjust only really emerges in the 20th century during World War I, she says. Then she says that the American, the Patrick Henry line, "Give me liberty or give me death," right? That we will fight for liberty and even die for liberty. Or another way of putting it is better death than slavery. Um, she says this is downright ridiculous. She does, she says this in many of her writings. She doesn't think, there's a line, "Fiat justitia et pereat mundus," let justice be done, even if the world should perish, right? And she talks about that in her essay, Truth and Politics, and she says this is absurd, right? You know, if the world perishes, that's not going to give you justice. And who's gonna, so she thinks it just doesn't make any sense. She says also in the same essay, you could say the same thing about fiat libertatis et pereat mundus. Let um let freedom reign or the world perish. And she says also that's ridiculous too. But even though it's ridiculous, she says freedom has still become the last refuge of justification for war. It's the final justification. Um, she then says something very interesting on page 4, right, where she says, it's in my version, it's at the bottom of page 4. It's in the paragraph that begins, "It is important to remember that the idea of freedom was introduced in the debate of war." And at the bottom of it, she says, could it be, she asks this question, could it not be that our present perplexity in this matter, the matter of war and freedom, indicates our lack of preparedness for a disappearance of war? Our inability to think in terms of foreign policy without having in mind this, quote, "continuation with other means" as its last resort. So could it be that our problem is that we're not prepared, A, to think about the fact that wars will no longer be fought, and that as a result, we have to think of foreign policy without war as the continuation of politics? And you probably can recognize the famous line by Clausewitz from his book on war, where he says that war is politics by other means. What she's saying here is that war has become so devastating and so dangerous, nuclear war, chemical war, these kind of things, that we've taken war off the table. It's not really possible anymore. And that has devastating consequences for our foreign policy, right? Because as Clausewitz tells you, and as the Greeks tell you, and as the Romans tell you, and here as Arendt is telling you, politics is great, but there are some problems that can't be solved by politics. I know that's something none of us want to think about, and none of us want to hear. But there are some conflicts going on in the world that some of you probably care a lot about that may never be solved by politics. And what Arendt is saying is we're no longer able to solve them by war. Now you could say, oh, well, she's simply wrong. Look, there's wars. There's wars in Russia, Ukraine. There's wars in Israel, Palestine, Gaza. And I think what her answer would be is those aren't wars. In the sense that And again, this is not going to be, I mean, I think this is what she would say. I could be wrong. I don't know what she would say. This is how I read what she's saying. So let's keep it to that. I don't know what she would say. But I think what she would, what the result of what she's saying is this, that if you really were fighting a war to win, these wars would have been over, well, in the Middle East would have been over 40 or 50 years ago. And the one in Ukraine would be over. I mean, one side is clearly much stronger than the other side in both times. But because of the utter devastation of modern warfare, we hold back. We're not able to do everything. We're not able to, and so they become more like what does Putin call it? Police actions or special, I forget what he calls it, special, military operations or something like that. Um, because every time you are close to actually winning, fully destroying your enemy, you say, I can't do it. It's too destructive. We can't do it. And and I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I think she understands that's a good thing. The war is simply too devastating. But she sees a problem with that, which I think we're all living with, which is that as a result, our foreign policy has to think about the time that there are now problems in the world that are unsolvable because they're unsolvable by politics and they're unsolvable by war. And that's a situation that, as she says, I think in a typically Arendtian understatement, indicates our lack of preparedness for the disappearance of war and our inability to think in terms of foreign policy without war as a continuation of politics by other means. Um, she she then says that wars are so unjustifiable today, that we have to take seriously the fact that wars may disappear, right? Uh, in this way that I was talking. I mean, yes, there's still skirmishes. Yes, there's still battles. Yes, there's still death and destruction. And yes, there's still war crimes. But it may be that war, in the sense of total war, um, uh, is going to disappear. And maybe she's wrong. Maybe Gaza and Russia prove that she's wrong. We could have that conversation if people want. Um, the last point I want to make about this opening section is about violence, which comes up at the end. I've already mentioned it a bit, but I'll just bring it up within the context of the text here. She says that war and revolution share a common denominator in both being set amidst violence. But she also says that violence, this is on pages 8 and 9. She says that violence is not the essence of either war or revolution, right? Violence, she thinks, is marginal in politics because politics is about persuasion and power and acting in concert and speech and action. But she thinks that the presence of violence in revolution and war situates war and revolution, therefore, outside of politics. This is the key move she makes. War and revolution are apolitical or extra political. And just like the pre-political state of nature, she says, in which you can have people living together that doesn't lead to a politics because she thinks the state of nature is not a politics. She says there are also situations in which people live together outside of a politics. The break in tradition, our broken world, could be seen in that way. And what she says is that in such a situation, we need a founding, a beginning. And the beginning is separated from everything following it as though by an unbridgeable chasm, she says on page 10. The beginning is always extra political. And what she says is throughout history, the beginning has always been violent. Cain slew Abel, Romulus slew Remus on page 10. On page 10 to 11, she says, and this is an extraordinary quote that I think all of us should at least read and take to heart, whether we agree with it or disagree with it, right? She says, the tales of these foundings speak clearly. Whatever brotherhood human beings may be capable of, whatever political unity we are capable of has grown out of fratricide, the killing of our brothers. Whatever political organization men may have achieved has its origin in crime. In the beginning was the crime, not just the word. When the pillars of tradition break, when authority is shattered, we need a new foundation. We're in a revolutionary crisis right now. Whether we actually ever have the revolution or whether we just stay in this crisis for generations is up to us, is up to whether we have revolutionaries who, as she says in another text, are able to articulate and inspire a foundation of freedom that can bring a broken people together, right? So has our loss of faith in beginnings and revolutions led us to the abandonment of revolution and thus to the abandonment of politics? I'll end there and say that, as I said, I think this book is so relevant for many reasons, but one reason is simply that it takes with utter seriousness the despair of our situation and asks what examples in history can teach us what it would mean to refound freedom. And that's what we're going to be discussing for the next few months as we read this book. Okay, you can participate either by writing in the chat. Please do be respectful of each other and feel free to do that. The chat is often great. I don't get a chance to read it because I can't read and talk at the same time. I know I should be, but I can't. The other way to participate is to go down to your little react button at the bottom of your page on your Zoom screen, click on that and click raise hand, and I will call you in the order in which people raise their hand. Look forward to the conversation. Like I said, by the way, I just want to acknowledge the other person who always thought this was Arendt's most important book today and who I talked about it often with was Jerry Cohn, who died last November. To talk about this book again without him is always something that is, well, it makes me remember him and the beauty of his life and his persona. So just wanted to acknowledge that as we jump into the conversations. And he'll be here in spirit. Okay, thank you. Jason, you're up.
Thank you, Roger. I wanted just to jump in on the final note here about the necessity of before there is the founding, there has to be a crime, and I'm wondering. I'm very much in love with the story of Romulus and Remus as the founding principle of Rome. That's how Rome got started, right? Was like it was Remus jumped over the wall of Romulus, and Romulus said, "Don't jump over my wall," and then clubbed him to death with a shovel. And it was the wall that was the point um, of contention, saying, use the door, you fool, don't jump over my wall. And that kind of transgression, if I'm understanding this right, that transgression is the inciting moment for politics. We need to have a transgression for there to be a reason to say, hey, you know what, maybe we shouldn't club each other to death. Maybe we should have agreements and say, hey, don't jump over my wall. Hey, don't break into my house. Is that more or less what she's trying to say?
So that's a great question, and I also love that you told the story, which is wonderful. So I think almost, but not quite. And here's the difference. I remember I said there were three stages that she talks about, right? One is the violent crime, the liberation. Two is the hiatus, and three is the foundation of freedom. Within the American Revolution, right, the violent crime is the revolution, the fighting, the war. And it's a liberation from tyranny. The hiatus is the Articles of Confederation and the founding of freedom, depending on, she never says it exactly and she makes it unclear. It could be 1789 with the foundation of the Constitution, but it also could be a little bit later. She says that freedom only becomes founded when the Constitution came to be worshipped. And so what I would say within the Rome example, right? The wars against the wars fought by Aeneas and others are part of the liberation. Romulus killing Remus is still a part of that liberation and violent act that is establishing the city of Rome as free from tyranny and any violence. But the foundation of the Roman Republic does not happen until you end up with SPQR, right? The Senate, the Senate and the people of Rome understood in a constitutional sense as sharing power and becoming a people with authority in the Roman founding fathers, just like the American founding fathers. So I think the Remus Romulus story is part of the liberation story, if you want to put it in her framework. And the founding moment isn't until there's this acceptance of authority. Does that fit with that? Does that make sense to you, Jason?
It does. I read Joseph Reichbert's The Story of a City, where he talks about the founding of Rome and the necessity of plowing the land to demarcate. And then you look at all the Roman coinage and even other nations, you look on their coins and it's someone guiding the plow as being the fundamental thing that you do to establish a civilization is you incise the land.
Yeah.
Right. And you make a law or a wall.
And the whole idea of culture, right, from is connected to the idea of cultivation, of cultivating the land. And Arendt talks about that in her essay, Crisis and Culture, right? And she says that the Greeks didn't have an idea of culture in that way. The Romans invented that. And so yes, but none of that founds freedom until you have the Senate and the I'm blanking on the people's the Tribune. So until you have the Senate and the people and there's a constitutional connection on the tablets and everything, I don't think she would think that there's a foundation of freedom. So the revolution only happens then. Okay.
Got you. Thank you.
Thank you. Nicole, you're up.
Yes, hello everybody. 3 points. The first one is this essay, What is Authority? I find quite difficult because I always wonder if she doesn't idealize the past, and also her saying that you can write the story only after it took place, but the agents, the one in acting, never know how it will end. So what is the kind of lesson we can take from what this violence of beginnings and but I must say I have some doubt about how that helps understand us when we are in the situation that we are in, and not looking over the situation we are in. Voilà. So just that. Is she a little bit there falling into the problem of idealizing the past? On freedom, you alluded to it, but I'm not sure I understand. Maybe it will come later in the reading of the book. But is it to be founded, or are we doomed to be free whether we like it or not, as she says in the end of Willing? Is there a clignotement, I would say in French, a sort of Is this both at the same time that we are doomed to be free whether we like it or not because of contingency, or is freedom to be founded? For me, there is a contradiction in these two ways to look at freedom. And finally, about, yeah, she mentioned, where you mentioned that she said in the Greek police, there is politics and plurality among citizens. And in the foreign affairs, outside the police, it's war. I wonder the extent to which we can transpose now the global village, so to speak. Could the global village, which the world is, be considered as a Greek police at a mega level? So is there any sense to transpose plurality between great powers? Could it be that they could discuss with each other? Could the UN Security Council be that kind of Greek police at global level? Do you
Right.
think this makes sense?
So thanks, Nicole. Those are three huge and fascinating questions, and I'll see what I can do. The first one, about, you asked a couple questions in the first one. One about idealizing the past, but I don't think she idealizes the past, but I'll push that aside for a second. What I do think is the interesting question that you asked there is, you said that, we only know the story when we tell the story after we tell about the action, so that if we're a revolutionary, we have no idea if our revolutionary action will succeed or not. And that's true, which is why action is so daring and takes so much courage. He says courage is the first virtue of politics. You have to act not knowing whether you will be seen as a hero or a criminal, or ignored, right? Those are three basic possibilities for all actors. You can act thinking you're doing this great thing and people can just ignore you and you've accomplished nothing, and that's the worst maybe of all the possibilities. You can act and try and create a revolution and you're seen to be a criminal and you're killed or imprisoned, and at least then you were taken seriously. And third, you can act and create a revolution and be seen as a hero. And of course, we never know the outcome of our action until we're dead, usually till long past our own lifetime. So that is the challenge of action. And you have to act because you believe in it and because you are committed to it, not knowing if you know how the reaction will be and whether you will be immortalized or not. And that is one of the paradoxes of action. On the question of freedom, I think that's a wonderful question you asked. You said that on the one hand, I said that freedom has to be founded, and on the other hand, she says in certain places that we're doomed to be free. Both are true, but they're true for on different levels. As Augustine said, man was created so that a beginning would be created and freedom would be created. As human beings, right, we are fated to be free insofar as we're human. We are beginners. We have it in our fundamental capacity to surprise people, to do new things. And so in that sense, we're doomed to be free. But whether we are able to found a political group or a political polis or whatever you want to call it, a political entity, and found freedom in a common world, that's not something we're doomed to do. It's something that happens rarely. And once it happens, it often doesn't last very long. And that's the problem that she's engaged with in this essay, in this book. The third question is also a fantastic question, so I want to thank you for it. You said, well, the global village is sort of like a Greek polis, the whole world. And if you think of it that way, there's no outside, and therefore there should be no war. Everything should be governed simply by politics. In that sense, you've created what Arendt called a world government, which she said was the was most likely to end up being a tyranny, right? Because she thinks every government is likely to become corrupted and centralized at some point. And that's why she is so against nation states. But what she believes, and this is what a large part of this book is going to be about in the 2 chapters on constitutionalism, is about the need to decentralize power, to create a federalist structure that pushes power away from the center and to the margins. And her worry is that if you were to ever have one world state, it would eventually be captured by tyrants, and there would be no place left to go. At least if you have a comity of nations and federations, if the world state is captured, you can go to other states, and there are other states where freedom continues to exist.
No, but okay. The point is that the government is part of a democratic.
She thinks democracies can be tyrannies too, Nicole.
Right, yes, but plurality and the Greek polis is not a government, so I don't believe in the world government at all, at all. But okay, thank you very much. And then just to add that maybe this authority issue, because most in history there is very little women who got authority, whose authority was acknowledged, so to speak. Maybe I resist to that as a woman. I don't know if the other women on the code would agree or not, but I wondered if they had a feminist reading of this authority approach of Arendt, and if she's not too much bending into the fact that it's normal that this authority was bared by men.
No, I mean, look, and we're going to get into that as we read in this text, right? Because we're going to talk about racism, we're going to talk about slavery in America, we're going to talk about feminism. All of these are part of the text, and especially in the chapter on the social question, as you can imagine. And and you're absolutely right. These are enormous problems with authority, and it's and it's one of the reasons it fails. But we'll get there as we get through the social question. Okay, thank you, Stephen.
Thanks, Roger. I want to follow up too on the issue of freedom. In reading Arendt's comment that the notion of freedom has been denigrated, and I thought about our current situation, of course, and in thinking about the far right, whom I would designate as counter-revolutionaries, I see very much of their rhetoric grounded in the idea of freedom. Freedom from immigrants, freedom from the woke left, freedom from government regulation, and so on. And it makes me think that they have a colorable argument that they are pursuing an Arendtian objective to reestablish freedom. And because I reject their values, I want to reject that argument. And it makes me wonder that whether Arendt's consideration of freedom here is too constrained, as you somewhat alluded in your response to Nicole, that there is this fundamental human freedom as all humans as natality implicating freedom and new creation. So I'd like to get your thoughts on that.
Thanks, Stephen. Yeah, let's take a look at on page 8, the end of that very long paragraph, right? Where she says that and such understanding of revolution can be neither countered nor replaced with an expertness in counter-revolution. For counter-revolution, word having been coined by Condorcet, right, has always remained bound to revolution as reaction is bound to action. The counter-revolution will not be a revolution in reverse, but the opposite of revolution. Has remained what it was when he pronounced it in 1796, an empty witticism. Counter for against Condorcet, right? She wants to say that counter-revolution is bound to action. It is a kind of action. And it in that sense can at least make a claim to power and founding freedom or a new revolution against the Condorcet's argument. And so I think your question therefore becomes incredibly important, right? Which is the in the United States, what is called the MAGA movement, and around Europe and other places is called sort of the populist movement. Is this a revolutionary movement, right? Some of you have probably noticed in the last few weeks, I've written 2 or 3 essays on trying to think through this movement as a revolutionary movement and what it would mean. And I don't think there's only one answer to it. What I've tried to argue is that it is a revolutionary movement in one sense, in that it is clearly seeking to destroy or liberate, right, the first stage, from what it considers to be a tyranny. The tyranny that it is concerned with is the tyranny of a kind of unreflective liberalism, and that it thinks has lost any connection to common sense. But what I've also argued is that it is a revolution that doesn't have a way forward, right? It's whereas the traditional revolutionaries used to say you need to break some eggs to make an omelet, right? Because you have to, you know, the ends justify the means. The omelet is the ends, they justify the means. When Stalin said, first you break the eggs and an omelet will follow, or when Mao said, you don't create a revolution by, having people over to dinner, what Arendt says they mean is that they don't have the omelet in mind. They don't know what omelet they're making, right? They are simply trying to break eggs and destroy it out of a kind of resentment and anger at it. And they don't have in their heads a new idea that will found a new politics. And that's what I meant when I was talking earlier about how a revolutionary situation can last for a long time, because it's fairly easy when authority has broken and the world is broken and legitimacy is under attack. It's fairly easy to destroy the institutions of power and authority, right? It's not that hard. We're seeing it being done right now. We're seeing the courts, the universities, the judges, the newspapers, the media, they're being destroyed. They're being taken apart. And it's not hard, partly because they have brought it on themselves. They have become corrupt and one-sided and intolerant and tyrannical. And anyone who doesn't see that, we can talk about it, but I think that's true. But what's hard is to find a new idea that can unite a people, that you can build on. And I don't see that anywhere on either the left or the right now. And that's unfortunately, I think, the tragedy of our situation, or one of the many tragedies of our situation. I could say more, but maybe I should stop there. Okay. Thank you. Steve, caps, is that right?
Caps like you wear in your head.
Thank you. Good.
Okay. I look at one thing about Arendt is that she tends to get things down to essentials. And when you define a revolution as something where the authority changes, it just seems to me there have only been 2 revolutions since the 18th century. The one is the American Revolution, and the change in values was domestic. The source of authority became the people as opposed to the king. And the other revolution, or attempted, was in 1945 with the founding of the United Nations, because that attempts to substitute the source of authority internationally with an organization which is not a government, but would replace the use of power as the means of deciding differences between states. And so when we, in that sense, to get to the MAGA revolution, I'd say they're more, this is more like the Wars of the Roses than any kind of revolution. What you have is Jamel Bouie, writing in the Times, says that the ideal for the United States, as we all know, all people are created equal. And what the MAGA faction is saying is, no, we don't believe that. And so we're looking for, we don't need to look for a new idea. We maybe go back to what Arendt says about going back to the beginning. The beginning for us is all people are created equal. That's the beginning. Internationally, that's to me a different question.
Thank you, Steve. Appreciate that. It's insightful, thoughtful question. Um, you know, so, yeah, I mean, Arendt, I think you're on good grounds when you say that the only revolution, from the 18th century to the present that Arendt recognizes is the American, right? Because it's unlike the French or the Haitian or the Russian. She thinks the American Revolution was the only one of those revolutions that founded freedom. You said in the People, she'll disagree with that actually, as we'll get into, especially in the chapter on public happiness. She thinks that the French Revolution tried to found freedom on the people, and that's why it failed. And the American Revolution founded it instead in the Constitution and in federalism and in the intermediate institutions. It's a minor point, but I think you're right in the general claim. I've never thought of the but by the way, there are interesting claims made by people like Bruce Ackerman and others at Yale Law School, right? That there's a second American Revolution that happens after 1865 with the three Civil War amendments, right? 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And that's a refounding in a very profound way of the United States. One way to see what's happening with MAGA, right, is a War of the Roses over the second founding, right? The post-Civil War founding. Or some people would argue that a third founding would be with the New Deal in the post-Lochner era, and that part of what the MAGA movement is contesting is the New Deal. All potential ways of reading this, if one were interested. The UN is an interesting case. I hadn't thought about it. I'd have to think about it more. I mean, one could imagine that another version of, a new founding that one could point to, or attempted founding, was what is variously called the liberal world order, or the U.S. led backed, world order, rules based world order. And I think for a number of years, from like the 1950s through around 2010, that order had a lot of authority around the world, and it's clearly being destroyed right now. If it's not already destroyed, it probably is. And so, these are all ways of thinking about this through. I think, one can, I'm not going to tell you, that's not Arendt, that's you, right? And that's me, and we can use that. But I think you're right to think that Arendt helps us think in this way about what are the revolutions, what are the foundings, what are the counter revolutions, and those are important questions. So I'm not sure I can, we can, as we go through this, we can talk more about it. But I think you've raised some good issues. Is that that all right? Is that fair?
Well, that'll do for now. Thank you very much. Thank you for taking my question.
Oh, thank you and welcome.
Thank you.
Patty? Hi, Patty. You got to unmute yourself if you're there.
Thank you. I'm going to try to make some sense here. I hope I will. I'm still struggling with her relationship or lack of relationship between violence, crime, and politics, as in what I take as political discourse. And relating to page 9, where she says the point here is that violence itself is incapable of speech, and not merely that speech is helpless when confronted with violence. Because of this speechlessness, political theory has little to say about the phenomenon of violence and must leave its discussion to the technicians. So from there, I jump to, does that mean that if violence can't be reasoned with, then what chance is there for, even though she said that everything begins with violence, but I appreciate that she, in one point, she says that violence, she also describes it as a violation. So in that sense, I could think maybe it's not just physical violence, but it can also include violating a status quo, which I can then understand would be how revolutions are created. But then when she jumps to crime, it feels like that's a leap to me from violence and also from that definition. And I happened to be at an event last night where they were talking about international law and how that is being so completely ignored now by not just our domestic law, but how international law is being violated. And so to the earlier question that someone said about freedoms, doesn't this idea that she says, as you read, whatever political organization men may have achieved has its origin in crime. Well, then doesn't that open it up for anyone, like right now, the crimes and violence that are being done in honor of saying, oh, but we're changing everything and making everything better. Doesn't that just allow, as an earlier person said, an Arendtian condonation of what's going on right now?
I hear your question. I mean, I would hope no. I think no. In fact, I'm pretty sure no, but it's more complicated than simply a no. You know, it's one, by crime, she doesn't generally mean like stealing or, or hitting or assault, or even assassination. I mean, she means a founding crime, right? Where you, really, seek to, free yourself from a tyrant in a sustained way. What she's saying is that, I mean, is that violence is outside of politics, right? And that if you're going to have a revolution, you're going to need a pre-political act. Now, I've said, and I said it pretty forcefully earlier, that our world is broken, and what do I mean by that, and what does that mean? Well, if the world is truly broken and it's fully broken, then a revolutionary violence is at least something one can conceive. That doesn't mean you condone it, because as I said before, the possibilities are it could be ignored because people don't pay attention to it. It can be seen as criminal, or it can be seen as heroic. And that depends on how you do it and in what ideals you do it for. Clearly, to talk about what's going on today, the president and his movement think of themselves to some degree as revolutionaries. I've already said I think that in one way they're right, and in one way I think they're wrong. They are risking violence. They are, in fact, saying that the world is so broken that it justifies a kind of violence that will help refound a new order. One thing that could happen is that violence could be ignored, right? And many of us are going about our day-to-day lives without paying too much attention to it. And that may happen. Another possibility is that over time, that violence is rejected, and it is seen as criminal and either something to be punished or something to at least be suppressed. Or third, it could eventually be seen as having in some way restored some idea of right order and seen as heroic. There's a fourth possibility, right, which is that it just goes on, and there's a huge divide in the country between those who see it as meaningless, those who see it as criminal, and those who see it as heroic, and nothing is settled. And eventually a new president comes along and a new series of violence is happening that also don't get agreement. And what I call this revolutionary situation persists without any outcome. I think all of those are possibilities. Because I think that there's not a sense of where this revolution is going, I think it's very unlikely that it succeeds. And I think the most likely situation, personally thought, is that it just that we continue to live in this, and we seesaw between, people on the left and people on the right for another generation or two. And either that continues until some crisis happens that allows a new common sense, a new world to emerge, or the crisis gets worse and worse and we end up in a conflagration or civil war or something else happens. I'm not a prophet. I don't know. I don't have a silver ball or a Palantir ball, which maybe you could ask Mr. Alex Karp. Yeah, I think that, these are, Arendt can help us analyze and teach us how to think about how to analyze these questions. She's not a prophet. I'm not a prophet. We're not prophets. We don't know where it's going to go. But I think it helps. I personally think it helps to see and understand that we're in a revolutionary situation, and understand why destruction is so easy right now, but why rebuilding and refounding is so hard. And that's what we're going to try and understand. I hope that helps.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, the sun is in my eyes. Jessica Vargas. Yeah, Gonzalez.
Yes, thank you. So I always have trouble understanding what counts as violence, really. When I mean, I totally understand the opposition between violence and politics, but on the other hand, it's like, I mean, isn't even there a sort of a speech that is violent in itself, and that's important in what we're seeing right now in the erosion of politics? And isn't there ways of action that I don't know, disenfranchisement of citizens, for example, wouldn't it count as a way of violence that is sort of preparing for worse forms of violence? So yeah, it's I'm always struggling with what counts as violence and this sort of strong opposition that Arendt proposes. So if you could please comment on
Yeah,
that.
I mean, violence, has come to mean, we talk about symbolic violence, literary violence. There's all sorts of violences these days. In the context of this book, right, violence is seen as part of war and revolution. So I think we're talking about killing, bombing, destroying, attacking, you know, those levels of violence, right? What's going on in Russia and Ukraine and Israel and Palestine and you know, other places in the world, you know, you know, and the Uyghurs in China, and it's happened in other places in the Middle East. There's a lot of violence, right? Uh, are these wars or are these revolutions, right? And that's part of the question that one can ask. But yeah, I think in this situation, what Arendt is saying is, if you're going to found a polity, it's going to have to start from some act that is a kind of break, right? That's not connected to what came before. And how do you make that jump, right? And she's saying it's usually by some kind of act of violence that, in a sense, often no one knows, you know, like you can imagine lots of acts of violence. We've seen them all over the world right now, and most of them are not leading to revolutions, right? What distinguishes the act of violence that leads to a revolution from one that doesn't? Well, from the many that don't. On the one hand, it's not a question you can answer in advance because, as someone said earlier, it's a story, right? That's told after the fact. On the other hand, what she's saying is that the acts of violence that have more of a chance of leading to revolution are one that are done within a story and within a framework that articulates a common vision and a common world that that could form. And out of the sort of cauldron of violence, the idea would be that those ideas take root in a surprising and new way. But I believe that's what she has in mind. There's another sense of violence, which is simply liberation, right? As I said before, there's the Revolutionary War in America was simply a liberation from England, but it didn't found freedom. It was a war of liberation. It wasn't yet a revolution. It only becomes a revolution many years later, in her mind. And so that's another form of violence, just liberation. You know, I don't think by crimes that are like this, she doesn't mean things like ICE agents dragging people, you know, out of schools or churches, or you know, waiting, you know, for them while they're going through their legal processes and taking them out. That's not a revolutionary crime. That's just a crime. And I don't think that's what she has in mind. Nope. Okay. Gilbert, you're up.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So my question, I would like please to address it to Bernie Shaffer, who said that freedom from is not freedom. Then before I address my question to Bernie, I would like to state this evidence proof, this evidence example showing that refugees, migrants, most of the time enjoy freedom from the hosting countries. Another evidence example saying that little kids most of the time enjoy freedom from their parents. So now my question to Bernie. Please, Bernie, why freedom from is not a freedom? I would like to understand clear clarification in order to understand it well enough. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Gilbert. I'm not sure. Is Bernie someone who's been in the chat? I don't know who you're talking about, Gilbert.
Okay, it was written in the chat.
Is Bernie here and want to respond or not? I don't want to make anyone respond if they don't want to.
He's muted. He's muted.
There I am. Okay. Yeah, I am. Yeah. So what I meant by freedom from, when the comment was made about various people, particularly of the Magnum movement, making claims like, they to be free from people who are different from them, meaning freedom was the right to not have to engage with other people. And that is the utter and complete antithesis of politics, particularly as defined by Arendt. Right? Politics is the engagement of people with each other. And so what I mean by freedom, that freedom from is not freedom. Freedom is the ability to engage, and they're both denying themselves that and saying that they live in a non-political world where they do not have to engage with people, and are denying other people the opportunity to be political by claiming the right to silence them and for them not to participate. That's what I was meaning by my very brief comment that freedom from is not freedom. To be freedom from other people, to be free from tyranny and from government and other things, is a prerequisite to having freedom too. And what I meant was trying to distinguish. I hope that clarifies what I was getting at.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bernie, and thank you, Gilbert. Yeah, just to quickly add, we'll talk about this next week because it's in the next chapter. But Arendt, is going to distinguish, right, liberty from freedom, and especially civil liberties from political freedom, right? And she's a big believer in civil liberties, but she doesn't think that's what it means to be free, right? To be free is to be able to self-govern, to participate, and have the power to govern oneself, which is different from having freedom from in the sense of civil liberties. So we'll talk about that next week in the text, but it's a good question. Max.
Roger, I just want to point out someone named Rick has had their hand raised for a while.
Oh, I don't see another hand up.
Maybe because Rick doesn't have video on, but Rick.
Rick, are you there? And do you want to ask a question? Because I didn't see it. Rick?
Maybe Rick has left. So
I apologize. I did not know that there was another hand. I didn't see it.
Oh, good.
I've been trying to unmute and I can't. Now can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. Thank
Rick.
you very much. Well, first of all, Roger. Hi, Roger. How are you? Yeah, thank you for the great introduction to of course, a remarkable book. It's been a while since I've engaged with the center, so my Arendtian thinking muscles are a little bit atrophied. But as I was listening, my hand was up for quite a while, and my question a bit got stepped on and a bit got answered. And I just offer as a quick comment that I think the revolution that Arendt describes and that you were articulating today, if you look at Bangladesh recently and Nepal right now, we see something like what she's describing, including that you don't know what it is until it's over. And I think that Bangladesh went through that process, and Nepal may be going through it. And we do or do not know what we're going through. And to your point about our revolutionary condition right now, my question would have been, what is the source of the breakdown of authority? And it sort of got answered as you were interacting with so many other, I think, terrific questioners. But I would offer just one observation, which is that, over the last 30 years, we have seen authority destroyed because our institutions have been destroyed. And I don't think anybody, you look at the Supreme Court and its legitimacy crisis, which is well earned. You look at our Congress, which has become a spectacle, and people basically are losing faith in these institutions. When I look at MAGA, I think of a toxic stew, something like the Nazi movement, and I mean that intentionally, which is to say that there are elements of the loss of authority, the proper earned loss of authority, that are hijacked by this fascistic movement, and then turn to a sort of a very, very dark, evil outcome. And I think that's really what we see. Nothing revolutionary, but a gang that's basically seized the moment, is very well organized, and is pushing the country in an authoritarian direction. How far they will go, I don't know. And I think you're correct. I think you're a little more optimistic than I am. I believe that there is potential internal conflagration ahead. That's just my view. I think civil war is a possibility. We have more guns than we have people, and we have the military now occupying our cities or entering our cities. So I have very, very grave foreboding about what's coming. So that's sort of what I was going to ask you about. But as I heard you speak, you basically touched on all the things that I was thinking anyway. So there you have it.
Thanks, Rick. First of all, I think I said that I thought civil war was a real possibility. So, we're not that far off. Maybe you're more confident of it than I am. On Bangladesh and Nepal and other things like the Arab Spring and other revolutions. Yeah, I mean, I think that those are what Arendt would call wars of liberation, trying to overthrow a tyrant or someone. Whether or not a revolution will follow at some point is a different question. The bigger question you ask is, what's the source of the breakdown of authority? I don't have time to go into that fully right now. And it's not just one answer. I mean, for Arendt, you know her, Rick, so I don't want to, I know you do know her work. It starts to some degree with the scientific revolution and the turning away from the world and what she calls world alienation. And what that does is not turn us away from, religion doesn't turn us to the world. It turns us internal through Descartes and Kant and through the subjectivity of human cognition, and isolates us and turns us into to very much solipsistic beings. And as we become alienated from the world, we start to see the world through our own perspectives, and we lose a connection with a common world. And that's one beginning of it. Obviously, that has been going on for a long time, and there are other aspects of it. I think, in the contemporary sphere, the siloing of educated elites in their distinction from less educated people who live a different kind of life in the real world. One group more in ideas and in the internet and things, and globalized world, travel around the world, have passports in different countries and things like that, versus people who are very situated and settled in a particular area. And I think that that division, that break, where people fundamentally experience and see the worlds differently, is one of the big sources of the breakdown that we're experiencing now. But we'll have much more to say about that as we go through it. Steve, you get the last word. I'm going to let Steve have one quick last word.
Okay. Hi, everyone, Roger, Rick, and all my other friends. I was very struck by your opening remarks, Roger, and I wanted to make comments in a completely different direction than the one we're going. I was just very struck by Arendt's concern with the breakdown of what she calls authority, and that many of us would probably call the breakdown of tradition. and its hold on us is a similar concern that T.S. Eliot had when he was writing The Wasteland. I mean, he called it The Breakdown of Tradition, and he writes very strikingly about about this in The Wasteland when he talks about mourning coming to consciousness and so on. His point is that the tradition as we know it is dead, and that you can't dig it up like a dog. In fact, he uses that metaphor precisely. Can we bring back the dead not as a dog does, but by reviving it? And he says in the closing lines of the poem, The Wasteland, these are the fragments that I've shored against my ruins. And it's a very similar concern to the one that Arendt is expressing about, what is left from the tradition that we can revive.
Steve, just because we're sort of out of time, can I just quickly respond? Because I think it's a great point. I'm sorry, because we're just out of time. I think you're absolutely right. The difference that I see between Arendt and Eliot is that Arendt sees the breakdown of tradition as not a negative only, right?
Right.
At the end of What is Authority, she says, look, there's a great opportunity in the breakdown of authority and break of tradition, which is the opportunity to be free and found anew and build a new world. And that's what it means to be human. And that's our job. Now, she's patently aware of how violent, destructive, and chaotic that may be if it happens, which it may not. Right. But she has this faith, this optimism in human freedom to refound that I don't think you see in someone like Eliot.
Well, not in The Wasteland, but I think you do see it at the end of his life when he writes the four quartets.
Okay.
And I was going to come to that when he talks about seeing the world again as though for the first time, and that whole Dancer in the Dance, that whole shebang. I know we're out of time, so I'm going to shut up. But I do think Eliot comes around to Arendt's point of view later in his life. And I won't go into it now, but the other literary thing that's very striking to me, very similar to Arendt's concern with the breakdown tradition, is her contemporary, Claude Lévi-Strauss, who I think taught at the New School at the same time Arendt did. I'm not sure about that. But he also expresses these concerns in his book Tristes Tropiques. I was going to quote from it, but save it for next time. I just wanted to point out that there's a literary aspect to this too. It's not just politics.
Well, there's always a literary aspect to Arendtian politics, which has an aesthetic element to it, as we are seeing. Thank you all. This has been a great opening discussion. I'm really excited. We haven't read this book in the reading group for a long time, even though it's one of my favorites. And enjoy reading Hannah Arendt. We'll see you next week for the second chapter on the meaning of revolution. First chapter. Thanks very much, guys.